Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Making Sense, a Eurodollar University production. Ostensibly, this show is about macroeconomics and monetary policy, but I would be remiss if I didn't inform each and one of you that tomorrow, May 26, 2021, we will all be witnessing a super flower blood moon. That means the moon will be at its closest point to the Earth in the year. There will be a full moon during the month of May and a total lunar eclipse. Now, if these signs weren't enough, in a couple of weeks, America's Department of Defense will be testifying in front of Congress about unidentified aerial phenomena. Okay? Now, I've watched enough X-Files and Twilight Zone episodes to realize what this all means, and that this video that you're watching will likely be one of the last YouTube videos ever recorded, by humans at least. Good news, Jeff Snider and I are going to deliver a show that is worthy of the apocalypse because the Federal Reserve recently admitted something incredible, world-changing, that matches the moment. Now, before we discuss that, friends, how would you like to spend your last few hours, weeks, months in civilization and on this earth other than on social media? So if you believe the world will end in fire, you can contact Jeff on Twitter at Jeff Snider _AIP. If you believe it will end in ice, at Emil Kalinowski. And if you think all these things are just regular astrological phenomena and advanced human technology, then you can contact us at Bank Reserves Are Real Money and the Economy is Fine and Vanilla Ice Cream Tastes Delicious.com. Jeff, the apocalypse again.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to be able to live up to the billing here.
We are.
I don't know. I think you've built us up too much here. Although in the monetary realm, of course, our audience is certainly open to more of the esoteric subjects that we get into. And so maybe for them, this will be earth-shattering. I think maybe for most of the people, any casual observers might be underwhelmed. But our hardcore audience, people have been around for a long time. They will see the significance and the absolute amazement of what the Federal Open Market Committee has actually admitted in writing in public.
May 19th, the Federal Reserve released the meeting minutes of the Federal Open Market Committee meeting on April 27th and 28th. What is everyone talking about, Jeff?
Taper, where it's like it's May 2013 all over again. The Federal Reserve, their Open Market Committee meeting minutes mentioned, if conditions warrant, the Federal Reserve might, change their policy or something or other. It was a very weak statement, and it's the kind of statement that the FOMC releases in pretty much any release ever. It's sort of their, green, what do you call it? The sort of their warranty statement where they say, safe harbor, look, if things change, we're going to change with it. And of course, everybody ran with it given the inflation hysteria of the last couple of weeks. Oh my God, the Fed sees the inflation too. Therefore, they're going to start tapering QE, and that's the big deal. And that was really the thing that we need to pay attention to in the FOMC minutes. Is here we are. It's 2013 all over again. Taper tantrum time.
So they added this statement this time around? Is that what the big difference is? Like the statement itself, as you said, it's very mealy-mouthed. Let me read it here. A number of participants suggested that if the economy continued to make rapid progress toward the committee's goals, it might be appropriate at some point in an upcoming meeting to begin discussing a plan for adjusting the pace of asset purchases. So that's like four maybes.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're trying to make a point with them, right?
But how did the media react? I mean, is this new? It sounds like
I think
the media
it was confirmation bias. I think by and large, people were expecting huge CPI numbers, huge PPI numbers, as we just talked about before the previous segment. And then, therefore, it was like, oh my God, okay, the next part of that is the Fed needs to taper. And here's a bunch of words that sound like taper. And so it was really, I think that's really what it was, is like, okay, here's a statement. This Fed says if maybe, possibly, then we'll begin to think about adjusting monetary policy. And everybody, oh, that's taper. They're starting to think about taper when, it's just, the Fed basically including a throwaway statement.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I wasn't joking about the end of the world earlier. In this article, we're going to get to something really revolutionary, really a big change. It's just not what everyone thinks it is. And you can read along, by the way. It's at Alhambra Investments. It was posted on May 19th, and it's called Inflation Huge. Jay Powell did blink, but it had nothing to do with taper. All right, we've said taper a few times. 2013, just remind us, Jeff, right? What was the situation? Ben Bernanke was in charge, and he had initiated QE 3.4, and it was going to go, it was indefinite this time, right? It was going to go on forever. And then in a few months, it was over. Like it was, well, you tell this story.
Yeah, in the middle of 2013, QE3 and QE4 were not that old. And as you're right, the initial promise was that they would be open-ended. That was supposed to be the thing to distinguish them from the prior QE1 and QE2 because those were limited to a specific amount. And so here Ben Bernanke was saying, we're going to do a monthly rate as long as we need to do it. And then in the middle of 2013, all of a sudden he said, well, things look like conditions look like they're improving. Maybe we're going to start to consider cutting back on purchase. He didn't actually use the word taper. He used some other word. I can't remember off the top of my head. But he didn't say taper, but that's the word that became commonplace in the mainstream. And really it was, at that point, it wasn't that the Fed was going to stop buying bonds so much as, oh, these guys are confident enough that they're thinking about cutting back on purchases. How good must the economy actually be? Because usually the Fed's pretty cautious about these kinds of things. And if Ben Bernanke is sitting in front of Congress telling them he's going to think about cutting back on QE purchases that were supposed to be open-ended, things must be really good. And it's funny how the bond market reacted in that way, which is basically the opposite of the mainstream or the conventional viewpoint of long-term bond yields. Rising yields were a good thing. They were suggesting that the market was finally saying, okay, maybe this stuff is working. The unemployment rate in the United States is falling relatively rapidly. Therefore, hey, maybe this is the trick. Maybe 3 or 4 times was enough. And for a couple months there, that's what happened. Of course, it was wrongly called the taper tantrum when it should have been called something like, hey, recovery is finally maybe possible. And of course, it only lasted a couple months because it really wasn't possible. Ben Bernanke was himself engaged in confirmation bias, as the Fed actually did taper QE3 and QE4 starting in December of 2013, and then terminated them completely in December of 2014 as yields were coming back down. Again, the opposite of what's supposed to happen.
So you can see how people are excited this time because you can hear a lot of the same echoes, like the economy is doing very well, or appears to be. Inflation, retail sales doing really well. So you can see how, hey, last year we thought it was the end of the world. It was open-ended. It was a pandemic. It was the bubonic plague. And now they added something that says, well, maybe it won't be the end of the world, even though now we know.
Yeah, and don't forget, Jay Powell and the Fed this time around have been amongst they're in the cautious camp, right? They're the ones saying this is transitory inflation. So if you think that in the FOMC meeting from April, they say, we need to think about taper, it sounds like they've changed their opinion, which of course would have seemed to be more solid evidence for the inflation case. But again, if they were actually doing that, there wouldn't be 6 qualifiers in that statement that would say, oh, maybe down the road, eventually we'll begin to think about tapering.
Well, Jeff, as you always tell me, we have to be precise. There was only 4 qualifiers.
Oh, so I'm sorry, 4.
You're exaggerating.
I inflated the number of qualifications.
All right, folks. Let's get to what really got Jeff excited. Jeff, there was another part to this statement, and you say here, was where Jay Powell and crew really blinked. Tell us about it.
Well, bank reserves, right? I mean, bank reserves for, what you and I do, Emil, bank reserves are almost always the number one topic, right? Because we say they're not money. And I love the way you call them laundromat tokens, because I think that really speaks very well to what they are. They are money in a sense. They have a very limited, narrow use. But outside of that use, they're just kind of an accounting fiction. They're just a number on a piece of paper somewhere, or, number on a computer. But yet people think about them in the historical setting, of course, that hasn't changed since the 1950s, where bank reserves are a form of useful money. I don't, that never really was the case, but in the popular imagination, it seems like the Federal Reserve creates these things, lets the banking system use them. So how can it not be money? Bank reserves are money. And ever since the 2008 crisis, with all the various emergency non-standard programs like TAF auctions and overseas dollar swaps, who's at the end of those programs are more bank reserves. The word liquidity has gotten thrown around in with bank reserves too. So not only is bank reserves money, it's money printing, it's liquidity, it's all of these great things that you associate with monetary policy, accommodative monetary policy, and central banks doing what they're supposed to be. And we've been saying all along, no, no, no. At the very least, there's more to the story than bank reserves. Liquidity, money supply, all these other things. There are other things that are going on in the monetary system that you need to pay attention to. And if we actually take an honest look at the monetary situation globally, bank reserves, assuming we want to assign any monetary value to them at all, are way, 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 way down the list. All this other stuff, especially collateral, repo, and all these other things that we talk about all the time, those are the things you need to pay attention to. We don't care much about bank reserves. It's other things that really fill out the monetary picture. And so there's always been that disconnect because we're told to believe bank reserves are money when in reality and practice, this mountain of evidence says, no, there's much, much more going on than bank reserves.
And you list in your paper here some of the evidence. Because at one point there were so many reserves that the powers that be decided to start calling it abundant reserves. They could have said insanity reserves, bananas reserves, some qualifier to describe
egregious,
how outrageous,
egregious
super
reserve.
blood moon reserves. But as you point out,
no, that's the point, right? Abundant reserves has a purpose. Calling them abundant reserves, what does that do? It sends the signal out to the general public who doesn't pay attention to these things, quite understandably. I mean, most people don't. I mean, they're not going to take time out of their day to try to figure out what's going on in the monetary plumbing globally because it's, why would they? And so if the Federal Reserve says these are abundant reserves, you're supposed to take that and think, okay, the money supply is plentiful. The Fed says everything's abundant. I don't need to worry about these things because everything's abundant. The last thing on my mind, because I believe the Fed, is any sort of deflationary liquidity problem. That's just not going to worry about it because reserves are abundant. And that's the whole purpose in calling them abundant to begin with, is to say, don't even look over here. Don't worry about money. We've got it completely covered. Liquidity is more than plentiful. It's abundant.
Was it abundant enough during the worst of the 2008 crisis? Was it abundant enough to stop the 2011 European sovereign debt crisis, or during March 2020? And Jeff, could I include, because we skipped over one of the Eurodollar episodes there, the East Asian one, could we kind of include foreign exchange reserves as part of the broad reserve family being not enough, or the incomplete story? Or
I think
am
you
I
should.
reaching
Yeah,
too
absolutely.
far?
No, I think that's a separate story, but I think you're absolutely right. Reserves of all these different kinds are supposed to be, in the foreign reserve aspect, it's supposed to be an insurance for a global dollar shortage when we find out that it's not. Just in the same way, bank reserves are supposed to be sort of an insurance policy for banking system to use in case liquidity across all of these marketplaces or all of the activities that banks engage in starts to go awry. And we see time and time again, 2008, in the worst of the crisis, the Fed said reserves are abundant, but yet there was a crisis. I mean, if reserves are abundant and you have the worst panic in 4 generations anyway, then that should already tell you that bank reserves are not what everybody thinks they are. And the fact that these things have repeated over and over again is just reestablishing that fact, and it is a fact that bank reserves are not the complete story of money. And again, to our opinion, they're not even the most interesting part of it. They're a very small part of it, very limited and narrow use. We need to look elsewhere. So the fact that the Fed is saying these are abundant reserves and we keep having liquidity problems, we cannot equate abundant reserves with liquidity. There's other things that need to go in that space.
Well, you called them liquidity problems, but here we're making the point, you're making the point, these were 4 liquidity shocks in the middle of abundant reserves Two of them were global liquidity shocks, and two of them were regional in Europe, the largest economic region, and China, the second largest economy. It doesn't compute. And guess who has figured that out? Maybe they've figured it out. Do you want me to read it out, or do you want to?
No, go ahead. Let's get to it. Here's what
Okay.
the Fed said. Yeah, go ahead and read it.
This was in the meeting minutes. Nearly all participants commented that a standing repo facility, by acting as a backstop, could help address pressures in the markets for U.S. Treasury securities and Treasury repo that could spill over to other funding markets and impair the implementation and transmission of monetary policy. Here we go. In this regard, a number of participants noted the potential for pressures in short-term funding markets to arise from time to time, even with monetary policy operating in an ample reserves regime.
Yeah, from time to time. I love how they throw that in.
For titanic asteroid collisions with the Earth in the monetary order, 4 times in 14 years.
I know we've created these trillions of reserves to solve the world's money problem, and well, from time to time we might have problems. I mean, it's
Problem.
ridiculous, right? It's like, well, bank reserves are money, bank reserves are everything, and oh, by the way, from time to time we have these treasury market and treasury repo issues that may spill over into big problems that we have to completely alter the way we do things in monetary. I mean, the statement itself, of course, comes across relatively innocuous until you realize exactly what they're saying here, which is basically everything that we've told you, there's more going on. And we don't really want to get into it here, except to put in writing that, hey, treasury market, treasury repo, there's other things involved in the monetary system that from time to time may cause problems regardless of the level of bank reserves.
Even with monetary policy operating in an ample reserves regime. You put that in bold,
yeah, what are
all caps.
reserves ample for, right?
Nothing, I guess. Well, I mean, I don't know what they're for.
What's the point? Why call them? Yeah, reserves are ample and abundant, but that doesn't make them useful. And I think that's really our point of contention here. And the Fed is finally getting into the meat of that, which is, bank reserves are an accounting fiction. They're at the end of an asset swap. They're at the end of at the end of a monetary program, but that doesn't necessarily mean what everybody's been told it means. In a lot of cases, the Fed just lets imaginations run wild. That's this quote unquote money printing stuff that goes along with every quantitative easing. And here they are basically saying, well, it's more complicated than all of that. Like, yeah, no, that's exactly the case. It is more complicated.
You end it here very well simply. Reserves have indeed been abundant, but what they have not been is money. Jeff, my final question to you is, you say here that Powell blinked, and it does mean inflation too, just not in the way it's being described about. What do you mean?
Well, again, we started out talking about everybody thought Powell blinked when he said, oh, we're going to taper. And everybody thought, okay, he's changing position from now transitory inflation to, oh, we better get ready for inflation, so we're going to start talking about taper. That's what everybody thinks. The mainstream perception was Powell blinked about inflation. When as we just talked about, what he really said was, oh, bank reserves are not money. And the way that relates to inflation, of course, is if the Fed isn't printing money, then there isn't the printing money aspect to what's going on in the CPI and consumer prices in a broad fashion, not just in the United States, but everywhere quantitative easing has been tried, as we know from 20 years of quantitative easing in Japan as well. So where the Fed actually blinked when it comes to inflation is they finally put in writing in their minutes that, oh, by the way, from time to time, doesn't matter about bank reserves. And from that, everything follows. And yeah, I mean, it's a baby step for the Fed to make that statement. And there's other things going on. We talked about the paper, the repo paper, collateral, the Fed taking collateral out of the system, all these other, they're starting to get into these complicated areas where we've been for a very long time saying, ignore bank reserves. Those are only a canard. They're going to lead you down the wrong path. And for them to actually make that statement for the minutes for April 2021 of all months, it's a profound admission of hey, there's a lot more going on in the monetary system.
Jeff, it's very unlikely that you and I will be able to do a show tomorrow on account of the end of the world. I plan to spend the rest of my day reading my favorite poem, which is Darkness by Lord Byron. It is about the end of the world. But if, I guess there's a small chance that everything will be fine. If it is, we'll do another show again tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.
Well, you need to watch Independence Day because that's the end of the world that didn't turn out to be the end of the world. So there's always hope. And so in a world now where the Federal Reserve and the FOMC has put in writing that bank reserves are not the complete picture of the monetary system, there is hope. There is a future for humanity here.
You gotta give that speech that the president gave on July 4th. I remember that movie, 1996. That was.
You mean the fake president?
Was it? No, well, I mean, yeah, in the movie. Was he fake? Yeah. Not in the real movie, right? Not in the movie.
He was some fictional fighter pilot kind of guy. And
yeah. We need more presidents like that. That's going to come off as I'm saying bad things about President Biden because he's not a fighter pilot. I better cut it off.
Okay.
Okay. Talk to you tomorrow.
Okay, Emil, take care.